I sat in my cell, a condemned man. I could hear the guards approaching. They were coming to take me to my death. I didn't know how I would die, but I knew it wouldn't be quick. I knew it wouldn't be painless. Above all, I knew it would be cruel and unusual. Anyone who defied the king had their death live streamed to the world. It was certainly an effective deterrent. The guards took me and quickly brought me down the hall, saying nothing. After passing maybe a dozen doors, many of which I could hear screaming behind, the guards opened a nondescript door and shoved me in. When the door was closed, I saw that there was no handle on the inside. In fact, there was nothing. The walls were absolutely white, as was the ceiling and the floor. In the absolute silence of the room, I thought I got lucky. Perhaps this sensory deprivation room was meant to drive me to insanity. It might make for good TV for the viewers, and I hoped that by the time I died, I would be too far gone to even realize what was happening. I wasn't so lucky. After an hour, or was it 2? Maybe 3, it began. The walls and ceiling began to move, or maybe they were moving the whole time, but it was just so slow that I didn't notice. The pure whiteness was so disorienting. Once I realized it, however, it was quite obvious. The room that was once spacious was now starting to feel a little cramped. And then I realized that my punishment wasn't the sensory deprivation. I was going to be crushed. This is worse. After a time, several hours, maybe more, the walls were so close that I could touch them both by reaching out, and I could no longer stand up straight, and the room continued to shrink. As soon as the walls were close enough that I could brace myself on one and push the other, I tried with all my might to stop them. As I knew would be the case, they continued to move, slowly. The sheer terror of being trapped in a shrinking room is indescribable. I was beginning to panic as I thought about the pain that would come as the walls and ceiling slowly crushed me. It would be hours of excruciating pain before something finally snapped and killed me. I was now crouched down with my knees pushed to my chest. I couldn't move. The walls kept pushing in. My head was pushed down onto my knees. My knees were held together by the walls on either side while being pushed into my chest. It was so hard to breathe. Just as the pain was beginning to become intolerable, it stopped. The walls and ceiling stopped moving. That was days ago, and I knew I would be stuck here, unmoving, barely breathing until I died of thirst. This is worse. No one noticed when the school bus turned down Brownsville Lane. If they had, they might have wondered why, since no one lives that way, and certainly no children. But no one did, so the bus rattled and shook down the washboard surface of the road. Very few of the children on board were concerned. They rode the bus every day. It was safe and predictable, and if there was a change in schedule, then surely it was done under the watchful eye of an adult. A girl in the middle sat alone, staring wide-eyed at the changing landscape around her. The bus drove on down Brownsville Lane, the trees growing thicker as the sky disappeared from sight. Before long, the bus was shrouded in near total darkness, and the children began to notice something amiss. One boy gave a nervous cheer, not understanding that the bees buzzing inside his stomach were fear and not excitement. The rest of the children followed, buoyed by the inherent glee in not being headed towards school. Anxious chatter filled the bus, until finally the girl in the middle walked, shyly, haltingly, to the front. The driver stared ahead, navigating the increasingly narrow path the bus followed.
"Excuse me," she said,
voice barely more than a whisper. "Where are we going?" The driver didn't answer. She tugged at his sleeve. "Excuse me, sir, we have to go to school." The driver slammed on his brakes, silencing the overlapping conversations at the rear of the bus. Wordlessly, still staring ahead, he opened the door for the girl. She gulped and stepped off into the humid mid-morning air. Her feet had barely touched the ground before the bus roared away, leaving her standing alone on the dirt road. The eyes that watched her from the back window were fearful, all of the previous adventurousness gone. The girl watched until the bus disappeared from view and started down the long walk back to town. Dressed in a dirtied spacesuit, the astronaut did his best to control his breathing. It was difficult. The confined cabin would have proven claustrophobic even to the most adventurous of individuals. It didn't help that nothingness surrounded him, a complete absence of light. Even the farthest reaches of space were markedly brighter, with their darkness broken up by the stars. Heat suffused the cramped little pod. It was piloted by an American, if the markings on the outside of the craft were to be believed. In thick bold letters were the words United States. Plastered underneath that was Old Glory, slightly crooked. The astronaut reached out, feeling for the control panel. No flashing LEDs were there to guide his hands, and he slapped at bare wall. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he called out, hoping Mission Control could hear him. Only an odd whooshing sound and his own heavy panting greeted his ears. He tried not to let panic overwhelm him. Many a solo mission he'd been on in the past, but this was the first time he'd felt truly alone. A piercing alarm from somewhere he couldn't pinpoint broke his reverie. Oddly enough, the noise comforted him. He took it as a sign that he was not forgotten, that there was still some connection between himself and the rest of humanity. "Come in, ground control," he tried again. Though the alarm continued, he thought he might have been able to hear the muffled garble of voices. Sweat poured from his brow, and he tugged at the collar of his spacesuit. Its heavy material only added to his current misery. He could not see it, but it felt as if the air around him was simmering with heat waves. Blackness of a different kind began to swim at the edges of his vision. He tried once more to summon the faraway voices, but his lungs could no longer have the capacity. Even as numbness overcame him, fear still lingered. From chapped lips spilled the inaudible last word, "Mama." The firefighter shook his head, looking away from the sickening sight before him. The house had been well and truly gutted by flames, but enough of it had remained intact to piece together the scene. 2 victims had been claimed by the inferno. A woman had been discovered in the remnants of the kitchen. Her proximity to the source of the blaze, a toaster, indicated she had succumbed relatively quickly to smoke inhalation. The second body was much smaller. The kid, dressed in some odd costume, had been nearly overlooked. By some bizarre happenstance, the cardboard box he had hidden himself in had remained relatively untouched. The firefighter would have smiled at the vessel masquerading as a spaceship had it not been for the untimely passing. He took a moment to mourn the child. Out of respect for the boy's imagination, he noted in his mind the cause of death: burn up upon re-entry. He awoke to the huge, insect-like creatures looming over his bed and screamed his lungs out. They hastily left the room, and he stayed up all night shaking and wondering if it had been a dream. The next morning there was a tap on the door. Gathering his courage, he opened it to see one of them gently place a plate filled with fried breakfast on the floor, then retreat to a safe distance. Bewildered, he accepted the gift. The creatures chittered excitedly. This happened every day for weeks. At first he was worried they were fattening him up, but after a particularly greasy breakfast left him clutching his chest from heartburn, they were replaced with fresh fruit. As well as cooking, they poured hot steamy baths for him and even tucked him in when he went to bed. It was bizarre. One night, he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. He was sickened, but disposed of the remains as best he could. He knew they had just been protecting him. He lay down, confused but trusting as they ushered him back into bed. Whatever their motives, they weren't going to hurt him. Hours later, a burning pain spread throughout his body. It felt like his stomach was being filled with razor wire. The insects chittered as he spasmed and moaned. It was only when he felt a terrible squirming feeling beneath his skin that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him. They had been protecting their young. Everyone loves the first day of school, right? New year, new classes, new friends. It's a day full of potential and hope, before all the dreary depressions of reality show up to ruin all the fun. I like the first day of school for a different reason, though. You see, I have a power. When I look at people, I can sense a sort of aura around them, a colored outline based on how long that person has to live. Most everyone I meet around my age is surrounded by a solid green hue, which means they have plenty of time left. But a fair amount of them have a yellow or orangish tinge to their auras, which tends to mean a car crash or some other tragedy. Anything that takes people before their time, as they say. The real fun is when the auras venture into the red end of the spectrum, though. Every now and again I'll see someone who's basically a walking stoplight. Those are the ones who get murdered or kill themselves. It's such a rush to see them and know their time is numbered. With that in mind, I always get to class very early so I can scout out my classmates' fates. The first kid who walked in was basically radiating red. I chuckled to myself. Too bad, bro. But as people kept walking in, they all had the same intense glow. I finally caught a glimpse of my rose-tinted reflection in the window, but I was too stunned to move. Our professor stepped in and locked the door, his aura a sickening shade of green.